What's up guys, I'm Royal G and today we're bringing you a new series from Noob to Pro. We'll be covering everything players need to know about Valorant from the very basics all the way to the advanced strategies. The goal here is that if you watch every episode and integrate it into your gameplay, you can become an experienced player with solid fundamentals. So it serves as an all-inclusive guide for new players as well as a refresher course for more experienced players. In this first episode, we'll be covering how to properly set up your game, all the important settings you should change or at least look at, how to find a sensitivity that works for you, and even a short guide to setting up your crosshair. If you want to see something in specific, feel free to also use the timestamps to skip to the corresponding parts of the video. So without further ado, let's get into it. Like for all games, knowing the controls isn't always the first step. If you want to have a seamless experience playing, it's pretty important to get the right settings and setup to do so. So that's why today our main focus is to do just that and set your game and yourself up for the best gaming experience. In the first tab of your settings, under General, we first got Enemy Highlight Color. This setting dictates what color enemy outlines will have. Enemy highlight color by default is set to red, but most players prefer to either switch it to yellow or even purple. I personally use purple because it's easier for me to see, but it could be different for you. Try them out and find the one you feel most comfortable with. Then we have map settings. This is personal preference to some extent, and if you have other settings you're more comfortable with, that's fine as well. But ideally, you want to be able to see your entire map at all times. This means that even when your teammate spots enemies or the spike on the other side of the map, you can see exactly where that is and what's going on. To do this, you can simply disable Keep Players Centered, and the entire map will be visible at all times. This might be a little bit weird to get used to, especially when you don't know the map layouts yet, but the earlier you start, the sooner you get it down, so I suggest changing it as soon as possible. Scroll a bit down and you'll find instability indicators. This gives you little on-screen notifications when Valorant detects an issue such as high ping, low FPS, or other problems. For me, this is an option most people should just honestly disable. If you have unstable internet and it helps you not go for a peek or hide for a second whenever your ping is spiking, then that might be a reason to have it set on. But if your internet is good, it can still give you some false positives a couple times a game, and even if it's just for a second, I find it to be super distracting and even somewhat tilting. So I keep them disabled. Decide for yourself if you want these pop-ups, but for me, they hurt more than they help. Under the other section, switch always show inventory from off to on. This will make it so that you can always see what guns you have. If you walk over a Vandal without noticing it, you'll at least be able to see it in your inventory, making it easier to recognize later. I don't know about you guys, but when I coach people, it happens pretty often where someone picks up a gun and doesn't use it because they fail to notice. With this setting, hopefully that's no longer you. Some other things under the other tab include first-person handedness and show mature content. First-person handedness dictates which hand your character model holds the weapon. Theoretically, it would be best to change it out of the way of your dominant eye, so if your left eye is dominant, your model should be on the right and the other way around. You can look up online how to find your dominant eye and adjust accordingly, but this shouldn't change much, so it's up to you if you want to actually put in the time to do this. For show mature content, we'll just set it to on. When you disable blood, you get sparks instead, but those are not nearly as visible as the blood splatters. And when you disable bodies, you get holograms, which admittedly are easier to find in res if you're playing Sage, but it's also not completely uncommon for them to get in the way and also be obnoxiously large while you're trying to fight someone behind them, aka they get you killed. For some people, it might also be worthwhile disabling show spectator count, as when it's enabled, it showcases exactly how many teammates are watching you. I know a lot of players can feel pressure when their friends or teammates are watching, so if that sounds relatable, it might be an idea to just turn it off. This may alleviate some of your anxiety when you're in a clutch and can win you an extra round here and there. Under controls, a lot can be left on default or whatever keybinds you prefer, but there are some things we'll recommend changing. First of all, binding jump to your mouse wheel as well as your regular jump key. You can bind it either to mouse wheel down or up, depending on which one feels more natural. This allows you to input jumps more consistently, which is required for something called bunny hopping. Bunny hopping is a pretty useful movement technique since it lets you move more freely in some areas, but we'll cover that in another episode. Once you do that, you'll notice that an exclamation mark in the equipment tab shows up. This will be for the cycle to next or previous weapon bind, which also uses the mouse wheel by default. That's fine, just hover over them and click the minus icon on both of them to unbind them. This means you'll no longer be able to use your scroll wheel to select weapons, but that's a good thing, since you're really not supposed to. The faster and more consistent way to select weapons is by using your 1, 2, and 3 buttons on your keyboard, so the same thing goes here where the earlier you get used to it, the better. Even if you don't use mouse wheel to jump, we still recommend unbinding it. A bit below the weapon selection, you'll notice something called Don't Auto-Equip Melee. This means that whenever you use an ability like Rain and Dismiss, Jet Dash, or other abilities that temporarily take away your guns, you won't automatically pull out your melee, even if you accidentally had it out before. Having this setting on can save you from some pretty embarrassing moments where you're ready to peek someone only to notice you're not holding your gun. Also under controls, there's the equipment tab. Here you can show whether you prefer to have your aim down sights and sniper rifle aim down sights on toggle or hold. By default, these are set to toggle, so if you press your right mouse button, you scope in and stay scoped in, but some players may actually prefer to have this on hold, as that's more common in some other games. As usual, set this to whatever you prefer. Now let's move to video settings. You want to go to the graphics quality, where we're of course looking to maximize our FPS, as more performance in frames can also help with your performance in game, due to input latency. To do that, you basically put everything on low or off. Anti-aliasing is on none, and anisotropic filtering on 1x. Except one thing, and that's bloom, which should be on. Bloom makes it so that lights are brighter. That makes your gun more shiny, but more importantly, it also lights up enemy outlines, and even the outlines from things like Sova darts, making both enemies and enemy utility more noticeable. Additionally, you can also experiment with NVIDIA Reflex Low Latency under the General tab. For most users, on plus boots means the highest performance and least input lag, but definitely read up a bit on it first. Then under the audio settings, we have Enable HRTF at the very bottom. This is a setting that makes the audio be better tuned to enable players to locate enemy positions. Basically, it just makes it clearer whether someone is above you to the left, behind you to the right, or anywhere in between. Switching it on might make your game sound weird or different initially, but you'll quickly grow used to it and you'll have a better experience overall. Of course, for any other setting in here, such as music, you just want to enable or disable things to your preference. While you're in audio, you can also take a look at voice chat and tune the incoming volume setting to make sure your teammates' voice comms are at an audio level that's easier to understand, but not too loud. So now that we have game settings out of the way, it's time to set up your other aspects of your game that can shape your gameplay. The first thing here is sensitivity, which is unique to pretty much everyone. It's important to find the right sensitivity because it means making aiming as easy as possible for you. Newer players tend to use higher sensitivities way more often than they should, so finding a setting that makes you comfortable is key. Remember, the goal is to find a sensitivity that makes aiming easier, not flashier. To find the sensitivity, there's a few things you can do. One way is to go to AimLab and do the sensitivity finder. Here you have the program automatically find the setting you aim the best with. By going into the AimLab settings and putting your game to Valorant, you can then see what your ideal Valorant sensitivity would be. Alternatively, you can also attempt to find your sensitivity manually by going into the range and moving around the bots while tracking them. Your tracking should be smooth, not jittery, and it should be relatively easy to track the targets. If you're constantly overshooting the target and your crosshair is shaking a lot, that means you might want to lower your sense. If you can't keep up with the target and have to constantly readjust back onto it, you might need to raise it a bit. And once you have a general idea of where your ideal sensitivity is at the moment, feel free to look at pro settings and find one that might be close to your current sensitivity. In reality, it doesn't make much of a difference, but maybe it gives you a little bit of a confidence boost. But make sure not to change sensitivity too often because you'll have trouble in the early stages of building your aim. And finally, we have crosshair settings, the last thing we'll cover. Crosshairs are the reticles that you have for aiming. Personal preference plays a huge role in this, and that means finding a crosshair that's right for you is mostly based on what you think feels good to aim with. Once again, the goal of a crosshair is to make aiming as natural as possible for you. So go to your settings, and under crosshair you first have the option for advanced options. Enabling it allows you to have different crosshairs for when you're firing regularly from the hip, fighting scoped in, or scoped in with a sniper rifle. This gives you a lot of room for customization, but most people prefer simpler crosshairs. Something to note is the fade crosshair option. By default, it's set to on, and it basically means that the top part of your crosshair fades whenever your weapon accuracy is decreasing. This setting lets you keep tabs on whether your bullets are going straight or experiencing recoil effects. A lot of people like to have this on, but some players may also find it very distracting. Now we go to primary, where a lot more options are. A good starting point is scrolling down and disabling outer lines. Both outer lines and inner lines function the same, and having both on might overlap two different crosshairs and is only when you want to create some really interesting looking things. Then under inner lines, you're also going to want to disable your firing error there. This means that your crosshair is not changing depending on what weapon you're using or whether or not you're firing, but rather a static basic crosshair that is more comfortable in use and generally more stable. The last thing I'd change for now is setting your inner line opacity to 1 instead of 0.8, which means your crosshair is not see-through at all and can be more easily distinguished from the background. Now that you've changed these settings, you should have a basic white crosshair. From here, you're completely free to customize it yourself. At the very top, you can change your crosshair to a color of your liking. Below that, you can enable or disable outlines and change their opacity. If you want a dot in your crosshair, you can enable center dot, and on the inner lines part, you have the option to increase your crosshair length or even width and length separately by unlinking them. Inner line offset dictates how large the crosshair gap is, and with inner line thickness, you can obviously dictate the thickness as well. Of course, if you want some inspiration, you can always check out some of our top 10 crosshair videos to give you a better idea of what other people like to use, including the pros. And that wraps up our first episode of Noob to Pro. If you want to keep up with this series, make sure to subscribe. Our next episode will be on basic aiming principles and mechanics in game, so stay tuned. Take it easy.